The church in Asheville was filled with muted light, the kind that made everything appear softer, though grief had no softness to it. Photographs of Daniel stood at the front, one of him in his college graduation gown, another in his business suit. The boy I raised turned into the man I admired. The weight of losing him pressed heavier than the oak casket before me. My hands, worn from a craftsman's life, gripped the program too tightly, the edges already creased from nervous folding. The seat beside me had remained empty, as it had been for years. That silence, that absence, was almost comforting. It belonged to Evelyn, my late wife. But the moment I felt movement, that peace cracked. A woman glided down the aisle, each step deliberate. Gasps and whispers followed her. Eleanor. 15 years gone, yet here she was, settling into the seat at my side without hesitation. Her perfume cut through the smell of lilies. Her arrival was intrusion enough, but it was the confidence in her posture, as if she belonged here, that made anger stir in my chest. I kept my eyes forward, on Daniel's photograph, but the murmurs among the guests swelled. Eleanor's presence wasn't just unexpected, it was disruptive. People leaned in, trading glances between us, wondering how the mother who had vanished could sit as though she had never left. When the service quieted and the first hymn rose, Eleanor leaned toward me, her voice slithered through the solemnity. "All this, our fortune," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the casket. My jaw tightened. Her words landed like ash on a wound. Heads nearby turned, sensing tension, their gazes heavy on the back of my neck. To them, I must have looked like the intruder, the silent old man beside the grieving mother. "You were just the caretaker," she murmured again, her lips barely moving. "Daniel's wealth, it belongs to me." Humiliation burned through me hotter than grief. The church, meant to honor my son, felt like a stage where I was being erased. Guests craned their necks, pretending not to listen, but I saw the sympathy shift in their eyes. They didn't see the years I'd carried Daniel through late-night homework, his first heartbreak, his first car. All they saw was the woman who called herself mother. When the pastor invited family to speak, Eleanor rose with tissues in hand. She swayed theatrically, voice breaking in practiced intervals. "My son," she repeated, her tone dripping with possession, as though the boy she'd left behind had always been hers. The words sliced through me. A few people dabbed their eyes, offering condolences to her as if she had borne the weight of his life. My fists clenched under the pew, the wood biting into my palms. Memories of her absence clashed with the reality before me. She was stealing what little was left, my dignity, Daniel's truth, and yet I remained silent, because rage in a church felt like betrayal to Daniel himself. After the service, the doors opened to cool air and hushed voices spilling into the courtyard. I thought perhaps the torment had ended, but Eleanor wasn't done. Standing among Daniel's colleagues and neighbors, she lifted her voice loud enough for all to hear. "Daniel's father has no claim," she declared, eyes cutting toward me. "The estate, the fortune, it's mine by right." The words stung sharper than the mountain wind. Around me, familiar faces avoided my gaze, some nodding uncertainly at her claim. My hand crushed the funeral program into a ball. Grief had stripped me enough, but now humiliation threatened to hollow me completely. And then I saw it, the smirk on her lips as she turned away. A sleek black car waited, the door already open, like she had planned this performance all along. She slid inside, leaving me standing with whispers buzzing in my ears. In that moment, the silence I had carried for years hardened into resolve. "If she came for everything," I muttered under my breath, "she'll find out I've got more than silence to fight with." The morning light spilled weakly through the kitchen blinds, catching on the folded program from yesterday's funeral that still sat beside my untouched coffee. The house was too quiet, as if even the walls remembered Daniel was gone. My hands rested flat on the table, trying to still the restless thoughts that had kept me awake all night. The knock at the door came sharp and deliberate, not the kind neighbors use. My chest tightened. I already knew this wasn't going to be a visit of comfort. On the porch stood a man in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, briefcase polished to a shine that had no place in my modest neighborhood. Mr. Rourke? His voice carried the rehearsed politeness of someone used to getting their way. Yeah, my answer was clipped, steady. He extended a hand I didn't take. Martin, I represent Eleanor. The name landed heavy between us. Without waiting for an invitation, he unlatched the briefcase and withdrew an envelope. The seal bore the weight of official authority. This, he said, sliding it toward me like a dealer with marked cards, is notice of Eleanor's claim to Daniel's estate. She asserts her legal right as his mother. The estate totals approximately $40 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. 40 million. I hadn't even thought about numbers. To me, Daniel wasn't a balance sheet. He was the boy who scraped his knees in the yard I built. The man who worked late nights calling me just to hear my voice when the world weighed heavy. I signed the receipt he pressed forward. My hand didn't shake, though inside it felt like a storm was breaking loose. This wasn't grief anymore. It was war. Martin sat across from me at the kitchen table, his pen resting near my old carpenter's pencil that had been there for years. The two objects seemed to glare at each other, the slick, expensive pen of a man paid to bend truths against the scuffed pencil of honest work. Eleanor has a strong case, Martin said smoothly. She was Daniel's biological mother. The courts look favorably on bloodlines, and her absence, well, that can be explained as hardship. A woman making hard choices. I stared at him. My jaw stayed tight. In my head, images ran wild. Eleanor nowhere to be found during Daniel's surgeries. Not in the bleachers at his graduations. Not in the waiting room when he faced his toughest battles. She had traded presence for absence, commitment for abandonment. Now she wanted to rewrite history. You'll want to avoid a public fight, Martin added, his voice sharpening. She's prepared to pursue this aggressively unless you step aside. The air between us thickened. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My silence stretched long enough to rattle him. The look in his eyes shifted, just slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to a broken old man or a man sharpening his resolve. Tell Eleanor, I finally said, steady as a chisel. I don't step aside. The door closed behind him, and I exhaled for the first time since he'd arrived. The papers lay on the table, cold and impersonal. I brushed my fingers against the carpenter's pencil as if grounding myself in what was real. That's when another knock came, softer, uncertain. Opening the door, I saw Michael, Daniel's closest friend. His shoulders seemed to carry grief as heavily as mine. In his hand, a thick sealed envelope. Ansel, he said, his voice low. Daniel gave me this months ago, told me to bring it to you if... He hesitated, swallowing hard. If Eleanor ever showed up. The envelope looked ordinary but felt weighty in my palm. My chest tightened again. Daniel, even in death, was still trying to shield me. Michael gave a firm nod, then left me standing there with the envelope pressed against my chest like it was a heartbeat. The house seemed to shrink as I sat down again. Legal documents on one side of the table, Daniel's letter on the other, 2 envelopes, 2 futures, one written in the cold language of law, the other in the handwriting of my son. I traced the edge of the envelope with my finger. The silence around me pressed in. Every muscle ached to tear it open, to hear his voice again, even if only through ink and paper. But opening it meant facing truths he thought I'd need one day, truths that might hurt worse than what Eleanor had already done. Her smug smile at the funeral replayed in my head, her voice calling me nothing but a caretaker. Heat rose in my chest, but grief cooled it into something sharper. Resolve. The contrast between the 2 envelopes couldn't have been clearer. One represented a battle imposed on me. The other, a trust given to me. My thumb slid under the seal, hesitation freezing me in place. Daniel, I whispered into the quiet. What did you prepare me for? The flap tore halfway before I stopped. breath catching. The letter sat there, half revealed, the words of my son waiting like a hidden truth on the edge of my grief. The kitchen clock ticked. My hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what was coming. The house had been quiet all evening, but the kind of quiet that pressed on the chest rather than offered peace. A single lamp in the corner spilled a soft glow across the living room, leaving shadows dancing on the walls. My hands rested on the sealed envelope for hours, its weight pulling me down like an anchor. Finally, with breath held, the seal tore beneath my fingers. Daniel's handwriting stretched across the page, steady and deliberate. "Dad, if she comes back." The words stopped me cold. My son had foreseen what even I had not allowed myself to imagine. He knew Eleanor would return, not for him, but for what he left behind. Each sentence pulled me deeper into grief, as if burying him twice over. His words weren't only farewell, they were a warning, a shield he had crafted for me long before the battle began. The letter trembled in my hands. At 70, I'd held tools heavier than steel and endured storms that bent trees to the ground. But nothing had shaken me like the paper between my fingers. Stronger than any courtroom paper, truer than any lawyer's claim, it was Daniel's voice reaching through time to stand beside me. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and the memories came flooding uninvited. Daniel as a boy, lying in a hospital bed after breaking his arm on a summer afternoon, his pale face lighting up when I walked in with a small toy truck. His college graduation, where I sat alone in the bleachers, waving until my arms ached, Eleanor nowhere to be seen. Late nights in the garage, his laughter filling the air as we fixed up an old Chevy. Grease smudged on his cheek like war paint. Through it all, her absence had been constant. She wasn't there for the pain, for the milestones, for the small victories that shaped a man's life. Yet at the funeral, she draped herself in grief and claimed a motherhood she had long abandoned. The thought made my jaw tighten until I felt the bones strain. Daniel's letter pulled me back. "If you need help, some of my friends know the truth. I trust them, Dad. They'll stand with you if she ever tries to erase what you've done for me." My eyes burned, not from age, but from a mix of sorrow and pride. Even in death, my son thought of me, protecting me against the storm he knew was coming. The clock ticked into dawn before I realized I hadn't slept. My hands ached from clutching the letter through the night. When the first light pushed its way through the blinds, I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into a small lockbox. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a cornerstone. The first stone in the wall I'd have to build against Eleanor's lies. Stepping outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of dew on cut grass. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, feeling every year of my age in my bones. Across the hedge, Nora Mallory, my neighbor, waved. Her eyes carried both kindness and something heavier, something she hadn't yet dared to say. "I saw her after the service," Nora said quietly, as if sharing a secret might invite trouble. "Eleanor, she was speaking with some folks outside the church. She told them how much Daniel needed her, how she was the only one who stood by him." The words hit harder than I expected, though I should have known. Eleanor had always been skilled at twisting a story until she looked like the victim. Nora's gaze softened, her voice nearly trembling. "I know the truth, Ansel. Everyone who lived here knows. But she makes people doubt what they remember." For a moment, the weight of isolation pressed down. But then I realized Eleanor might own the whispers for now. But I carried something she didn't. Daniel's voice. His trust. I thanked Nora, her hand lingering on the fence as though she wanted to say more. Fear flickered in her eyes, but so did loyalty. I understood. Not everyone was ready to stand against a storm. Back inside, I opened the lockbox once more, touching the letter as if to steady myself. Eleanor wanted to claim money, yes, but she also wanted something far more cruel, the rewriting of Daniel's memory, the erasure of my years as his father, that I could never allow. I closed the lockbox with a firm click and whispered into the stillness. She may own the whispers now, but I carry Daniel's voice. The house had barely settled when the phone rang, sharp and insistent. My heart tightened before I even lifted the receiver. Martin's voice came through, calm and calculated. "Mr. Rourke, it's time we moved this matter to court." The line went dead, but the echo of it lingered. The storm had found its way to my doorstep, and this time, it wasn't staying within the walls of my home. The phone rang early, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet of the house. Daniel's letter lay on the table beside me, the envelope still creased from where I'd held it through most of the night. When I picked up, Martin's voice came through, clipped and cold, with no hint of condolence. "The court has set the first hearing. You'll receive the summons shortly," he said, as if he were reading off a weather report. The line went dead before I could answer. Later that afternoon, a county deputy knocked at the door. He handed me the thick envelope, official seal pressed into the corner. The weight of it seemed heavier than it should have been, more than paper ought to weigh. I set it on the kitchen table next to Daniel's letter. 2 envelopes, one a legal weapon, the other my son's last shield. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at both. The clash of worlds laid out in front of me. One carried Eleanor's ambition, the other Daniel's trust. I whispered to the empty room, "I won't break." The following evening, the community hall was packed. Folding chairs lined in uneven rows, the air thick with the smell of coffee and floor wax. I had come out of respect for the meeting, not to speak, only to listen, to keep some rhythm of normalcy in a life that no longer felt my own. But when Eleanor stepped through the doors, all conversation stilled. Dressed in black from head to toe, veil draped dramatically over her hair. She looked every bit the grieving mother. She clutched tissues in one hand and made her way to the front row. Within moments, her sobs filled the room, echoing off the cinder-block walls. "I lost my only son," she cried, voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I was kept away from him, denied a mother's right." Heads turned toward her, pity written across faces I had known for years. Neighbors I'd shared tools with, men I'd worked alongside, women who had watched Daniel grow, all of them shifted their gaze, drawn to her spectacle. The whispers began, low but cutting. So tragic. Imagine being kept from your child, and there I sat, invisible. The decades of nights spent at hospital bedsides, graduations, birthday dinners, all erased by a performance of tears. I stood finally, my voice steady, though my chest burned. "Daniel was not abandoned," I said, each word pressed carefully into the silence. "He was raised with love, with sacrifice. He had a father who stayed." For a brief second, I thought the words might pierce through the illusion, but Eleanor lifted her head, her cheeks streaked with tears, and countered softly. "He kept Daniel from me. You don't know what I suffered." Gasps rippled across the hall. Some nodded, others frowned, uncertain. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bathing us both in their glare. It felt less like a meeting and more like a stage, truth and lies colliding in front of an audience that didn't know which to applaud. I scanned the crowd and saw a flicker of hesitation in a few neighbors' eyes. Doubt had planted its seed, small as it was. Eleanor noticed too, and pressed a tissue to her lips, her body shaking with sobs that seemed perfectly timed. I walked out into the night, my steps heavy but faster than usual, anger propelling me forward. Humiliation trailed me like a shadow, but something else had joined it now. Resolve. Eleanor had shown her hand. She would stop at nothing. She wasn't only after money, she wanted to erase me, to rewrite Daniel's life in her image. The cool air cut across my face as I neared home. Stars flickered faintly above, indifferent to the battle beginning on earth below. I unlocked my front door, ready to retreat into the quiet. But as the lock clicked, headlights washed over the porch. Across the street, a car idled. Eleanor's sleek sedan, the same one I had seen at the funeral. The outline of her figure was barely visible behind the glass, but I knew it was her, watching, waiting. She didn't step out, didn't wave, The car just sat there, humming softly, its beams fixed on my house like a spotlight. I closed the door and leaned against it, the image searing into my mind. This was no longer grief shared in silence. It was war declared in silence. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place that seemed to carry the weight of decades of other people's battles. My shoes echoed against the tile floor as I made my way through the entrance. Every head that turned toward me felt like a judgment. Some pairs of eyes softened with pity, others narrowed as if they already knew what Eleanor had told them. There she was, near the front, draped in black like a widow from a play. A dark veil shadowed her face, though I could still see her lips moving as she whispered with Martin. He leaned close, his silver pen already in hand, as if preparing for a performance of his own. I looked down at my suit, plain and a little tight in the shoulders, the same one I'd worn to Daniel's graduation years ago. No veil, no theatrics, just the fabric of a father who had worked with his hands all his life and buried his son only days ago. Inside my pocket, folded small, rested Daniel's letter. The thought of it steadied me. I walked toward my seat without a word, letting the sound of my steps drown out the murmurs. When the judge entered, the room rose, his gavel struck, and silence fell. That silence broke quickly when Eleanor's voice carried through it. She stood, clutching a tissue, her shoulders trembling just enough for those in the first rows to lean forward. "Your Honor," she began, "I stand here today not just as a woman in grief, but as a mother who has been cut away from her own child's life." The tissue dabbed her eyes on cue, though I noticed how quickly she peeked to see who was watching. "For years," she continued, "I was denied the right to know my son. Daniel was kept from me. His father," her eyes flicked to me with sharpness that didn't match her tone, "chose to raise him alone, excluding me, ensuring I was forgotten." The room shifted. I could hear small sounds, an old man sighing, a woman clucking her tongue in sympathy. The power of her words wasn't in truth but in performance. I felt myself shrink inside, as though invisible again, as though my decades of fatherhood were being peeled away in front of strangers. The judge listened, face unreadable. When she lowered herself back into her seat, some of those strangers nodded at her, believing. That was the twist of the knife. Then the judge's gaze fell on me. "Mr. Rourke, do you wish to respond?" I rose slowly, my knees stiff, but my voice when it came was steadier than I expected. "Yes, Your Honor." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When Daniel was 10, I sat by his hospital bed after his appendix burst. She wasn't there. When he graduated high school, I clapped so hard my hands ached. She wasn't there. When he got into college and called me crying because he didn't think he could afford it, I sold the tools from my workshop to make sure he stayed in. She wasn't there. I looked at Eleanor, her tissue frozen halfway to her cheek. For 15 years, she wasn't there. A low murmur moved through the benches. Different this time. Questioning, uneasy. I could see heads turning not toward Eleanor, but toward me. Her tears suddenly looked thinner, her performance less convincing. Martin jumped up, his voice sharp. "Objection irrelevant, Your Honor." "The issue here is inheritance law, not—" The judge cut him off with the crack of his gavel. "Sit down, counselor. I asked for his response. He will finish." Martin's jaw clenched as he lowered himself. Eleanor's veil shifted, and for just a second, I caught the glare beneath it. The tenderness she'd shown moments before evaporated. What stared back at me was anger, sharp and unveiled. The judge leaned forward. "This court will not move forward on stories alone. Evidence will be required. Testimonies will be called. Both parties will have their chance." His gavel struck again, ending the session. I lowered myself back into my seat, my hands trembling, but not from fear. In my chest pocket, Daniel's letter felt warm, as if reminding me that the truth was still mine to carry. When I stepped out into the courthouse steps, the sun was sharp and unforgiving. I breathed deeply, ready to walk away, when a shadow blocked my path. Eleanor's perfume reached me first. sickly sweet. She leaned close enough that only I could hear. "You think your quiet little stories will save you?" she whispered, her voice stripped of the softness she'd shown inside. "You'll lose everything, Ansel, just like you lost him." Then she pulled away, her veil falling back into place, her expression calm for anyone watching. She turned, Martin trailing behind her, and descended the courthouse stairs. I stood frozen, Daniel's letter pressing into my chest like a heartbeat, her words cutting deeper than anything she had performed for the judge. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual as midnight settled over the house. Papers lay scattered across the table, corners curling in the lamplight. Daniel's letter rested on top, its edges already softened from being read too many times. The words inside still echoed. "Dad, if she comes back." Nora had stopped by earlier, leaving a pot of soup I hadn't touched. And she'd looked me square in the eye, telling me not to give in, not to let Eleanor's voice drown out the truth of all those years. Her presence lingered even now, a reminder that not everyone had been fooled. The summons for another hearing weighed against my chest pocket. Across from it, in the same jacket, Daniel's letter pressed close to the heart, one side cold, the other warm, two different truths competing for space in my life. With a slow breath, I gathered the scattered papers into a neat pile, telling myself over and over, I won't break. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and nerves. Eleanor sat dressed in black again, her veil tilted just enough to let the room catch glimpses of her trembling lips. Martin leaned in, his leather briefcase propped open, whispering strategy. When the judge entered, Martin wasted no time. He stood tall, voice sharp, and produced a folder from his case. He claimed mismanagement, funds shifted, property transferred unfairly. His words rang out like a hammer against an anvil, each accusation meant to paint me as careless, greedy, undeserving. Eleanor gasped on cue, a hand to her chest, pearls rattling softly in her grasp. People in the gallery leaned forward, their whispers filling the air like buzzing flies. Every hour spent working for Daniel, every night in the hospital by his bed, it all seemed to vanish in that instant, replaced by Martin's neatly typed lies. My hands tightened around the worn edge of the table, knuckles white, but I forced them to loosen. Outrage would only feed their picture of an unstable old man. Instead, I sat straighter, listening, letting the storm run its course. When Martin finished, the judge turned his attention to me. The silence felt heavier than the accusations. With steady breath, I asked for time. Your Honor, I have the original documents. Daniel's will is signed and dated. What you've been shown today is not the truth. Martin bristled, already objecting, but the judge lifted a hand. Michael, seated quietly in the back, rose and approached. In his hand was a slim envelope. Without a word, he slipped it onto my table, his eyes meeting mine with a look that said everything. Daniel planned for this. I didn't open it yet. The mere presence of that envelope felt stronger than anything Eleanor's performance could conjure. The judge considered, then nodded. We'll reconvene when all original evidence can be submitted. This matter is not decided today. Gasps rippled. Eleanor's veil fluttered as she turned sharply toward Martin, her polished composure slipping for a moment. Outside the courthouse, the summer heat clung to my suit. Eleanor found me near the steps, her perfume cutting through the thick air. She leaned close enough for her words to be meant only for me. You're just an old man clinging to scraps, she hissed. This money was always mine. I held her stare, refusing to answer. Words would have given her too much. Instead, I stepped past, each stride heavier but deliberate. Daniel's letter pressed tight against my chest as if it could shield me. At the corner of the courthouse lot, Nora appeared, breathless, holding a bundle of papers wrapped in twine. Her eyes darted, scanning to make sure Eleanor wasn't watching. I found something, she whispered, clutching the bundle like treasure. Old records. You need to see this. There's a detail. Something we missed. The streetlight flickered above us, casting shadows long across the pavement. Back at my kitchen table, Nora spread the dusty papers, her fingers trembling as she pointed to a line buried in the text. My pulse quickened. For the first time in days, hope edged out despair. The courthouse corridor smelled faintly of old varnish and paper, the kind of scent that carried weight and formality. The low hum of voices fell silent as Martin stepped forward with that oily smile of his, leading in a man I had never seen before. His shoes clicked sharply against the polished floor, his eyes shifting too much to ever be trusted. Martin announced him like a prize he had been saving. "This witness will confirm," he said, "that Mr. Rourke mismanaged his son Daniel's medical bills, leaving Eleanor to shoulder burdens she should never have faced." Gasps rippled through the benches. Eleanor leaned into her role like an actress who had rehearsed every movement, dabbing at her eyes, shoulders trembling, gaze downcast. When the man swore his testimony and began speaking about bills supposedly ignored, I felt the weight of the room tip against me. Whispers spread. Heads turned. People I had never met looked at me as though I had failed my son in his darkest hours. My chest tightened, not with guilt, but with the cruel twist of seeing years of midnight hospital visits and sleepless nights reimagined as neglect. The truth felt like it had been snatched from me, replaced by their fiction. The judge's gavel restored order, but not my dignity. Eleanor's soft sobs echoed through the chamber, sealing their act. By the time the hearing adjourned, the seed had been planted. The next morning, a newspaper landed with a thud on my porch. I bent to pick it up, its ink smudging against my thumb. The headline read, "Mother Reclaims Son's Legacy." A photograph showed Eleanor in black, her face downturned, lips trembling in manufactured sorrow. Inside, the story painted her as a mother wronged by circumstance, struggling to protect her son's fortune from an undeserving father. My name sat in those paragraphs like a blemish, stripped of history, stripped of truth. When I stepped out later to buy milk, neighbors nodded stiffly or avoided my eyes altogether. One man, who had shaken my hand for 20 years, pulled his grandson closer and walked past as though I were some stranger. The folded newspaper lay on my kitchen counter all afternoon, like a silent accusation I could not ignore. Outside the courthouse the following day, the air was heavy with drizzle. I adjusted my coat, preparing to leave quietly, when Eleanor emerged from the crowd. Her heels tapped against the wet concrete, her eyes catching mine with a gleam that mocked the grief she paraded inside. She leaned close enough for only me to hear. "Everyone sees you for what you are now," she whispered. "A thief in your own son's name." Her breath carried perfume sweet as poison. My fingers brushed the envelope hidden in my coat pocket. Daniel's letter. That letter was more solid than the courthouse walls, more enduring than her stagecraft. I did not respond. Silence was my refusal to stoop to her level. She smirked at that silence, mistaking it for defeat. But I knew better. Every performance has a curtain call. That evening, Nora came to my door. She carried a folder of papers, her expression grave yet lit with the flicker of something I had almost forgotten. Hope. "Ansel," she said, laying the documents across my table. "I went through old records. That so-called witness, he's been paid. Cash transfers from Martin's office. Dates, amounts. It's all here." My hand trembled as I traced the lines of proof she uncovered. For the first time in days, my shoulders eased, even if only slightly. "Can this save us?" I asked, voice low. Nora met my eyes without hesitation. "Only if we use it before Martin burns the trail." The papers between us seemed to glow under the kitchen light, stacked beside Daniel's letter. Evidence of lies against the truth of a son's last words. Two weapons in a war I hadn't chosen, but one I could no longer avoid. The courthouse felt more like a theater that morning than a place of justice. Every pew in the chamber was filled, neighbors I had known for years, distant relatives I hadn't seen in decades, and even reporters who smelled a story. Their chatter buzzed like flies, rising and falling as I walked through the aisle. My shoes struck the tile with steady beats, and though I kept my head high, I could feel the eyes following me, weighing me, doubting me. Across the room, Eleanor swept in, draped in a dramatic black shawl, her veil pulled low over her face. She leaned close to Martin, whispering in his ear. Whatever she said made him smirk as he adjusted his papers. Theatrics, that was her battlefield. Mine had always been quiet endurance. The judge called order, and the buzz of voices died down. The day's hearing began. Nora was called, my neighbor, who had shared coffee with me on quiet mornings and left casseroles at my door when grief hollowed me out, now walked to the stand with trembling hands. She glanced at me, her eyes steadying, then lifted her chin. She pulled a folder from her bag. Inside were receipts, hospital bills, and discharge forms, years of paperwork with my name scrawled at the bottom. They were the proof of every long night I had spent at Daniel's bedside, every payment I had scraped together to keep him alive and well. These, Nora said, her voice shaking at first but growing firmer, are signed records showing that Mr. Rourke paid and cared for his son's medical needs personally. The accusations that he neglected or mismanaged them are false. The air in the room shifted. I heard the faint rustle of whispers ripple through the benches. Heads tilted, some faces softened. For the first time, cracks appeared in Eleanor's carefully painted image. She shot up from her chair, voice sharp. She's just a meddling neighbor. She knows nothing of what happened between me and my son. The judge's gavel struck once. The documents will remain in record, he said flatly. Eleanor sat, fuming, clutching her shawl tighter as though it could shield her from truth. Michael rose next. He walked forward with careful steps, holding a plain white envelope. He didn't look at Eleanor, only at me. He placed it in the bailiff's hands. This, he said quietly, was given to me by Daniel months before he passed. He asked that it reach his father if certain people came back. His voice cracked slightly on those words, but he pressed on. The bailiff delivered a small USB drive to the judge, who signaled for the screen to be lowered. The lights dimmed, and the courtroom seemed to lean forward as one. Then Daniel's face filled the screen, my son, alive, breathing. His smile weary but familiar. His voice filled the chamber, clear and unshaken. Dad, if you're seeing this, it means she came back. I need you to know. You were everything to me. You raised me when no one else would. You sat through surgeries, graduations, heartbreaks. She wasn't there. Don't let her rewrite the life we live together. This legacy, my work, my money, it's yours to protect, because it's ours, not hers. My hand clamped onto the wooden bench. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, spilling before I could stop them. Around me, gasps filled the room. The video ended, but Daniel's words still echoed, heavy and irrefutable. Whispers turned sharp. I heard someone behind me mutter, "So it's true. He raised that boy alone." Eleanor leapt from her seat, fury breaking through her mask. "That's a forgery. He's making this up to steal from me." Her voice was shrill, desperate, and every eye saw it. Martin tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she shook him off. Her sobs had vanished, replaced by raw anger. For the first time, the veil slipped, and the crowd saw the truth she'd hidden. The judge struck the gavel sharply, his face stern. "Enough. This court will take a recess. The evidence provided will be examined thoroughly before the next session." The gavel fell again, echoing through the chamber like thunder. People stood, voices buzzing, a storm of shifting opinions. Some still whispered sympathy for Eleanor, but others now looked at her with narrowed eyes, doubt cutting through pity. I rose slowly. Across the aisle, Eleanor's gaze locked onto mine. No veil, no tears, just the cold glare of a predator cornered. She didn't need words. Her eyes promised she wasn't finished, that this was only a pause in her campaign. But for the first time, I felt the weight tilt in my favor, not with lawyers or tricks, but with Daniel's voice from beyond the grave. Leaving the courthouse after the recess felt different this time. Just a week ago, the same steps had felt like a stage of humiliation. My name whispered in scorn as Eleanor paraded herself as the grieving mother. Now, a crowd had gathered again, reporters, neighbors, strangers leaning over the courthouse rails, but their eyes no longer cut me down. Instead, their questions pressed toward Eleanor. One reporter called out, "Mr. Rourke, how do you respond to her claim that the video was forged?" Another shouted, "Why did Daniel speak of you with such clarity if she says you kept him away?" The murmurs were no longer against me. People who had once averted their gazes now looked me in the eye. A man I recognized from the hardware store shook his head, muttering, 15 years gone, and she comes back now. Doesn't add up. The same newspaper that had branded me greedy only days earlier now carried headlines hinting at contradictions in Eleanor's story. I bent down to pick up a copy someone had tossed on the courthouse steps. The ink smudged on my fingers, but the words were clear. Mother's story faces scrutiny after neighbor's testimony. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the weight pressing against my chest loosened inside a quiet conference room. Martin's voice cut sharp through the walls. I hadn't been invited to that meeting, but word reached me through a court clerk who sympathized. He had chastised Eleanor, warning her that judges despised uncontrolled outbursts. She had nearly undone weeks of preparation with her theatrics. "Keep it together," he had snapped, leaning across the table. "You don't cry when it suits you. Then spit venom the next moment. That won't play in front of a judge." Eleanor, I was told, slammed her hand down. "You work for me, Martin. You don't tell me how to grieve." But Martin wasn't the same man I saw on that first day, brimming with confidence at my kitchen table. Now he leaned back in silence, eyes narrowing with unease. A lawyer knows when a case starts to sink, and I could see the retreat in his posture even from across the hall when we passed later. He walked ahead of Eleanor, no longer beside her. That evening at home, the courthouse noise still echoed in my ears. Nora came by, carrying a pie she hadn't planned to bake but knew I wouldn't refuse. Michael arrived soon after, setting Daniel's video drive carefully on the table as though it were holy. We sat together under the dim light, the letter and the video side by side. Daniel's handwriting and his recorded voice had become twin anchors for me. I ran my finger across the envelope edges, remembering how his hands had once guided mine when he was a boy, learning to build birdhouses in the workshop. He had left me more than money. He had left me trust. A map through the storm Eleanor was brewing. "Whatever she says next," Nora whispered. "This can't be erased. Everyone saw Daniel. Everyone heard him." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "And more will come." He made sure of it. Their faith steadied me. For the first time, grief mixed with gratitude. I wasn't entirely alone in this fight, but Eleanor wasn't done. The very next day, Martin filed an emergency motion. Word reached me through my lawyer. She now accused me of hiding offshore accounts, a wild claim with no evidence, but enough to stall a final judgment. I sat in the courthouse hallway listening to the clerk explain, the words falling like cold rain. Offshore accounts, millions supposedly tucked away, lies stacked upon lies, each meant to exhaust me, to make the truth feel unreachable. The judge, cautious, agreed to review the new motion. It meant more time, more hearings, more chances for Eleanor to twist the story. That night, back in my home, the air felt heavy. I set Daniel's letter down on the kitchen table again, next to the folded newspaper bearing Eleanor's unraveling story. Before I could sit, a faint scrape at the door caught my attention. I opened it to find no one. Just a single folded note slid beneath the frame. My hand trembled as I unfolded it. The words, scrawled in a hurried script, read, "She's going to destroy everything, unless you use what Daniel left behind." The paper shook between my fingers. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. The courthouse felt heavier that morning than on any day before. When I took my seat at the defendant's table, every movement seemed amplified, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of the crowd, the echo of the judge's gavel. Eleanor sat across the aisle, draped in a black shawl like a widow from some stage play. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, then leaned toward Martin, whispering frantically. My stomach tightened. Daniel's words from the letter still lingered in memory. "Dad, if she comes back..." The judge's voice sliced through the air. "Mrs. Whitmore, you filed an emergency motion claiming Mr. Rourke is concealing funds in offshore accounts. Produce your documentation." Eleanor rose with trembling hands, but too much bravado. She shuffled through a manila folder and produced a stack of photocopies, laying them on the bench as if they carried the weight of truth. The judge examined the papers, brow furrowed. "These statements," he said slowly, "are riddled with inconsistencies, wrong bank logos, dates that don't align with your son's death, or the estate filings. Mrs. Whitmore, where did you obtain these?" Her voice cracked. I was given them by a friend of Daniel's. He wanted me to know the truth." The room fell into a hush, every head turning. My palms pressed flat on the table, forcing myself to remain still. The judge stacked the papers neatly, then slid them back across the bench. "These are forgeries," he declared, "and presenting them as evidence is contemptible." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, Eleanor's mask faltered, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Martin stood abruptly, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, I can no longer represent Mrs. Whitmore. There are irreconcilable differences between my client's conduct and the standards of this court." Eleanor whirled on him. "What? You can't leave me now." Her voice rose to a shriek, startling even the bailiff. Martin kept his eyes fixed on the judge. "I respectfully request withdrawal." The judge nodded. "Granted. Mrs. Whitmore, you will need to retain new counsel, though I caution you that your behavior today does not help your cause." Eleanor lunged at Martin, nearly toppling her chair. "You're abandoning me like everyone else." His face remained stone. He gathered his briefcase, walked past her without a glance, and never looked back. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift, like a tide turning in my favor. When the session adjourned, the courthouse steps became a stage of their own. Reporters circled, microphones thrust forward. But the questions weren't about me anymore. "Mrs. Whitmore, why did you submit forged documents?" "Mr. Rourke, do you have any comment on your son's video testimony from yesterday?" Neighbors I'd known for decades, people who had turned their backs only a week ago, now approached with sheepish looks. One man removed his hat, nodding respectfully. "Ansel, I'm sorry for doubting you. We should have known better." Another woman touched my arm. "She fooled us all." But we saw Daniel's words. "We know the truth now." In my coat pocket, the folded letter warmed against my chest. For months it had been my private lifeline. Now it felt like a banner lifted high, restoring dignity piece by piece. Eleanor descended the steps alone, photographers snapping her every stumble. Her eyes burned when they met mine, but she said nothing. Without Martin, she was stripped of her last shield. That night, the sound of crickets filled the still air around my home. I sat at the kitchen table with Nora and Michael, sipping lukewarm coffee, when headlights swept across the windows. A car door slammed. Then came the voice, raw, venomous. "You think you've won? Ansel, you think this is over? That money is mine." I stepped onto the porch. Eleanor staggered in the yard, hair wild, face twisted with rage. She screamed accusations into the night, hands clawing at the air as neighbors emerged onto porches, watching. "You robbed me of my son. I'll ruin you before I let you keep it." Her words pierced the quiet like glass shattering. Nora called out behind me, voice steady. "I'm calling the police." Blue lights appeared minutes later. Officers approached cautiously, guiding Eleanor toward the patrol car as she kicked and spat. The neighborhood watched in silence. By the time the taillights disappeared down the street, the only sound left was the rasp of my own breathing. Michael stepped forward, slipping an envelope into my hand. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's time you saw the last thing Daniel prepared." The seal was unbroken, heavy, final. I closed the door behind us, clutching the envelope like it contained the last thread tying me to my son. Morning light crept into the kitchen, faint and cool, brushing across the table where the envelope lay waiting. Sleep had eluded me all night, and when the clock struck 6, I could no longer delay. My fingers shook as they slid under the seal. The paper inside was heavier than I expected. The handwriting instantly recognizable. Daniel's handwriting. "Dad," it began. Steady strokes that carried his voice across the divide of death. "If she ever comes back, know this. I want everything left to you. You were there. She wasn't. Don't let her rewrite my story. Tears blurred the ink. It was not wealth that pressed on me, but the unmistakable acknowledgement that my son had foreseen this very storm. He had chosen me again, even as life slipped from him. I held the amendment to my chest as though it were his embrace, feeling both grief and a measure of justice. By mid-morning, the courthouse loomed again. The steps felt higher, the doors heavier, though perhaps it was only the weight of the paper folded inside my coat pocket. Inside, Eleanor sat with her head bowed, dressed in yet another shade of black, a veil shielding her face. Yet behind the fabric, her eyes glittered with the same cold fire. The clerk called the session to order. Martin was nowhere to be seen. He had abandoned her days earlier. Still, Eleanor rose with unsteady dignity and announced her latest move. She claimed I was no longer capable of managing the estate. That age had eroded my judgment. That grief had clouded my mind. She filed a petition for guardianship, demanding that she be placed in charge of everything Daniel left behind. The room rippled with gasps. My chest tightened. It was no longer money she sought. It was my dignity, my very identity as a father and as a man. To be painted as helpless, incompetent, after decades of raising Daniel alone, it was a cruelty deeper than any insult. I stood slowly when the judge turned his gaze toward me. My knees ached, my back stiff, but my voice was steady. "Your Honor," I said, drawing out the amendment, "this is my son's own hand. Daniel made his wishes plain, and he trusted me not only with his childhood, but with his legacy. He left no space for doubt." The amendment was passed forward, the judge adjusting his glasses as he read. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding, until he nodded. "This will be entered into the record." I let my eyes sweep the room then, not to the judge, but to the neighbors seated in the gallery, to Nora's steady gaze, to Michael's quiet nod. I raised Daniel through every illness, every graduation, every long night when work and worry pressed harder than my body could bear. Eleanor was not there. I will not stand by while the truth of his life is twisted into something it was not. No anger touched my words. They fell like hammer strokes, deliberate, undeniable. The murmurs that rose this time carried a different timbre, questioning, shifting. Eleanor's veil trembled. Then her mask shattered. She sprang to her feet, voice shrill. "Lies Martin abandoned me. Nora meddled where she didn't belong. And even Daniel, he betrayed me, his own mother." The gallery recoiled. Gasps, whispers, shaking heads. In her rage, she revealed the hollow core beneath the act. The judge lifted his gavel, eyes cold. "That will be enough. This court will reconvene for final judgment tomorrow." The gavel struck wood, echoing like thunder. Outside, the sun was sharp, almost blinding after the dim chamber. My steps were heavy but firm, Daniel's amendment warm against my chest. The battle was almost over, yet everything, the truth, my dignity, my son's memory, hung on the edge of the judge's final words. The courthouse felt different that morning. The usual buzz of voices was replaced with a hush that pressed down like a heavy blanket. The oak benches gleamed under the pale light, and every seat was filled. Neighbors, reporters, curious strangers. Eleanor sat a few rows away, her hair disheveled, her hands clutching a worn petition folder as if it could still save her. Her face showed the cracks of desperation. I sat straighter than I had in weeks. Daniel's handwritten amendment rested in my coat pocket. The words of my son carried like a compass guiding me here. My heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with finality. Whatever was about to happen, the truth had already spoken. The judge entered, his gavel wrapping the room into silence. He scanned the courtroom, then fixed his eyes on us. "We are here today to deliver the final judgment in the matter of Daniel Rourke's estate." Eleanor shifted, her knuckles whitening as she clutched her folder. For once, I didn't look at her. I kept my gaze on the bench, steady as the wood beneath me. The judge's voice filled the chamber. "The petition filed by Eleanor Rourke has been reviewed. The claims of mismanagement and unfitness were weighed against evidence presented, including Daniel Rourke's personal amendment. He paused, letting the weight of those words fall over the crowd. I felt Daniel's presence, strong as if he were sitting beside me. Then came the words that would close this storm. The court rejects all claims made by Eleanor Rourke. The amendment is valid and binding. The estate, valued at $40 million, remains with Ansel Rourke as the sole heir. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled frantically. Cameras clicked, and for the first time in months, I breathed freely. Eleanor's face twisted in rage. "This isn't justice from me," she shouted, rising to her feet. But her cries fell flat. Reporters who once flocked to her now turned their lenses toward me. Neighbors who had once whispered against me now shook their heads at her, their sympathy spent. Her voice, once a weapon sharpened by performance, was now nothing more than meaningless noise. She stumbled toward Martin's old seat as if seeking an ally, but the lawyer had long since abandoned her, alone. She lashed out at the air, condemning everyone, the judge, me, Daniel's memory itself. Security guided her out, her protests echoing into hollowness. When the gavel fell one last time, it sounded like a door closing, not just on a case, but on years of silence, humiliation, and stolen dignity. Outside the courthouse, the steps that had once been a stage for gossip now became a platform for something else. Reporters asked me about my son, about his life, about the kind of man he was. Neighbors touched my arm, offering quiet apologies for doubting me. Each word, each look, restored a piece of my dignity. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with Nora and Michael. The lamplight glowed softly across Daniel's letter and the amendment lying side by side. Nora poured tea, her hands steady now, no longer trembling with fear of Eleanor's games. Michael leaned forward, his voice low. "Daniel knew what he was doing, Ansel. He trusted you to finish this." I unfolded the letter one last time. Daniel's handwriting swam before my eyes, but the message was clear. Trust, love, and the bond that no performance could erase. "Silence is not weakness," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of every trial. "Sometimes it's the strongest stand a man can take, until truth speaks for him." Nora nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. Michael smiled faintly. I leaned back, the ache of grief still present, but no longer alone. I had lost my son, but I had protected his memory. And in doing so, I had found a piece of myself again, the father who never stopped standing, even when the world tried to erase him. For those who doubted, the lesson was simple. Dignity, patience, and truth outlast manipulation and greed. For those who loved Daniel, the verdict was his voice carried forward. The house was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere in that silence, Daniel's memory lived, not as a fortune, but as proof that love endures.